Good morning, my name's Robert Taylor, I'm from CKT. Today we're going to run through some very basic suspension setups, some do's and don'ts relevant to road bikes and track day bikes. To carry out the sag checks, which is the first and most fundamental thing you need to do, the handiest tool you absolutely need to have is a tape measure. To start off with, we're going to need a couple of people to help lift the rear of the bike, and ultimately we also need the biological element, otherwise known as the rider. The very first measurement we take is the bike fully extended, wheel in the air. What we need to do is to have two people to actually lift the bike off the ground so I can take a measurement as vertically as possible from the end of the swing arm to a point that I've pre-marked on the tail fairing. Now, if we were going to lift the bike by the subframe, etc., especially on a race bike, there's so much flexibility in those subframes and tail fairings quite often that you can screw the reading up. Okay, we have a measurement here of 650 millimetres, a nice even number, thank goodness, which demonstrates our top out measurement. That's bike fully extended, wheel in the air, the suspension fully open, fully extended. That particular measurement is where we express every other measurement from. The next measurement we take is the static sag measurement, which gives us an idea if it's somewhere in the range. Very important to bounce on the bike to settle it first, to make sure it returns, and something I failed to mention previously, that we actually have the bike on a level surface. Our first top out full extension measurement was 650 millimetres. Using exactly the same measuring points, measure the new setting with the bike sitting under its own weight. We have, in this instance, 645 millimetres. So we deduct that from our top out measurement, which means we've got 5 millimetres of static sag. On a bike like this, with an original shock absorber in it, albeit heavily modified, and without an internal topping out spring, between 5 to 10 millimetres is a target measurement we're looking for, so it's somewhere in the window. The next step is to add the rider, and as I said previously, the rider needs to be fully kitted up in riding gear, etc., but we won't burden Dennis with that today. You'll notice the third person, dressed in shamrock colours, is holding the front of the bike without putting any weight on it. And it allows Dennis to sit in the race position or his normal riding position. Then if you ask the rider to just bounce on it a couple of times to settle it, and we'll take a third measurement, which will be the rider sag. And again, that is expressed as the difference between the bike fully extended and the rider on board. Same measuring points, same datum marks, and we now have a reading of 628 millimetres, which again we deduct off the top out measurement. So we have 650, which is the fully extended measurement, minus 628. That gives us 22 millimetres. Now on a bike like this, a 600cc class bike, with the rider fully kitted, we would expect to see a rider sag measurement of between 24 to 27 millimetres. That is for track day road race use. For road use, we would expect to see a measurement of between maybe 27 to 35 millimetres. It's as much about personal preference. The numbers are a guideline only, but it gives you a very reasonable starting point. One of the things about suspension that we're very preoccupied with is to reduce friction as much as possible. One of the big cardinal sins is inevitably with track day bikes and race day bikes, the wheels are taken out all the time to change tyres. When the front wheel is reinstalled, it's very important to align the forks. You just don't stick the wheel in and then crank everything up. Basically, with the forks, you have an axle that slides through when you put the wheel in, and it goes onto a shoulder on one side that it abuts against. On the opposite side, in this case on the R6, on the right hand side, we have some pinch bolts that will allow the fork to either squeeze inwards or outwards. Because there are bushings in the forks that are displaced, it's very easy if you put a front wheel in carelessly and you do the pinch bolts up to either squeeze the forks in inwards or outwards, and that can cause a massive amount of friction. So moving along, the axle must be smooth and clean with no wear grooves in it, and also the bore that it slides into inside the fork must also be smooth so that it can't catch. Lightly greased, install the axle, leave these pinch bolts loose on the side. That will help it to self-align. The next step from there is to push on the bike as briskly as possible without hitting the brakes, because the brakes can actually pull the forks. So what we do is we remove the ignition key and we just push briskly on the top of the triple clamp as hard as we can. I'm having trouble with this one, and that self-aligns the forks. We then move down and do up the pinch clamps. Job done. And then just recheck that we haven't introduced any friction issues. That's the very first step before you measure the sag in the front end. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate with people helping me to lift it because it's very, very simple, but pretty much the same procedure as with the rear. We take a fully extended measurement, which requires that you either have the type of stand that engages under the bottom of the triple clamp, which is going to let the wheel hang free in the air, or you have a couple of helpers to lift the bike by the handlebars, so you can briefly take a fully extended measurement. And that, as with the rear, is your top-out measurement from which everything else is expressed from. If, for example, the top-out measurement was 130 millimetres, and you then measure the static sag, and it's 100 millimetres, you'll have 30 millimetres of static sag, which is exactly the figure we aim for on bikes with well-sorted suspension that has got a lot of initial damping control. With the rider on board, you would add 10 to 15 millimetres on top of that figure. Another thing that you have to be very aware of with front forks is that almost all of them have an internal top-out spring, and some of those springs can be very long. If you change the preload to attain the correct sag figures, if you have to change the preload by a lot of turns, for example, that pre-compresses the top-out spring inside the front forks and actually lengthens the forks. So if you had to change the preload more than, say, 1 or 2 millimetres, you need to re-measure the fully extended measurement. You need to start again. That concludes our presentation on setting sags. But to not put too fine a point on it, springs are everything. The average production motorcycle is maybe set for a mythical 85 kilogram rider. If you're 110 kilograms, or say for example if you're 60 kilograms, you're absolutely going to have to change these springs because there's no way the bike will work properly. One of my pet hates is the marketing term fully adjustable suspension. It is not fully adjustable. Fundamentally, the spring rates have got to be right. Winding on preload doesn't change the spring rate, it only changes the spring force. If you're a rather well-fed person and the springs are too soft for you, they're still too soft for you, irrespective of where you have adjusted them to.